What happens when the person standing between you and your destination decides, simply by looking at you, that you don't belong? It is a question that shouldn't have to be asked in the modern world. Yet for Marcus and Dr. Evelyn Thorne, a dream anniversary trip was about to turn into a public nightmare at 35,000 feet. An airline crew, blinded by their own prejudices, refused to believe this black couple belonged in first class. They were about to be publicly shamed, but the crew's victory would be short-lived, because they made one catastrophic mistake. They didn't just insult a loving couple, they illegally ejected two of the most powerful people in American aviation. If you believe that dignity should be a right and not a privilege, and if you want to see how justice is served when arrogance meets accountability, please like this video, subscribe to our channel, and let us know in the comments. Have you ever been judged by your appearance while traveling? The hum of Chicago's O'Hare International Airport was usually a familiar symphony to Marcus Thorne. For 2 decades, it had been the background noise of his life, a soundscape of rolling suitcases, muffled gate announcements, and the kinetic energy of thousands of lives intersecting. Usually, Marcus walked through these terminals with a brisk, professional purpose. He was a man who moved with the weight of responsibility, often on his way to a tense regulatory hearing or a surprise audit at a maintenance hangar. But today, the rhythm was different. Today, he wasn't Inspector Thorne. He was just Marcus, a husband in love. Beside him, Dr. Evelyn Thorne adjusted the strap of her designer carry-on, a small, serene smile playing on her lips. She looked radiant, her presence commanding yet graceful, a woman who had spent years balancing the high-pressure world of aerospace engineering with the demands of medicine. For their 20th wedding anniversary, they had finally planned the kind of trip they made possible for millions of others, but rarely took themselves. A luxurious, 2-week escape to Paris. "Can you believe we're actually doing this?" Evelyn whispered, her voice cutting through the terminal noise. 14 days. No pagers. No emergency emails. Just us and the city of lights. Marcus squeezed her hand, feeling the warmth of her palm against his. "I promised you, didn't I? I'll try my best not to inspect the pre-flight safety briefing too critically." They shared a private laugh, the easy, comfortable sound of two people who knew the geography of each other's souls. They had booked seats 1A and 1B in the Polaris first-class cabin on Vista Airways Flight 112. It was an indulgence, costing thousands of dollars, but one they felt they had earned. Marcus, at 50, was a man carved from quiet authority. His salt and pepper hair was neatly trimmed, and his suit, though comfortable for travel, was impeccably tailored, hugging his broad shoulders. He possessed a calm, observant demeanor that strangers often mistook for aloofness, but in reality, he was a professional listener, a man trained to absorb the details that others missed. He had worked his way up through the Federal Aviation Administration, FAA, to become a senior air carrier safety inspector. He was the man who ensured airlines adhered to the letter of federal regulation. His word could ground entire fleets. Evelyn was his perfect complement. As a double doctorate holder in aerospace engineering and medicine, she was a leading FAA consultant on human factors. She wrote the very protocols that kept crews alert and passengers safe. But today, they were anonymous. Just 2 passengers seeking rest. They approached the priority boarding lane, documents in hand. The gate agent scanned their passes without a second glance. "Enjoy your flight, Mr. and Dr. Thorne." As they stepped onto the jet bridge, leaving the sterile terminal air for the climate-controlled atmosphere of the Boeing 777, Marcus felt his shoulders drop. This was it. The vacation began now. A flight attendant stood at the aircraft door, greeting passengers with a practiced, bright smile. Her name tag read Sarah. "Welcome aboard," she chirped. "Good morning," Marcus said, his voice deep and warm, showing her their mobile boarding passes. "We're in 1A and 1B." Sarah glanced at the phone screen, then up at Marcus, then over to Evelyn. Her smile didn't vanish, but it froze. A subtle, almost imperceptible shift occurred behind her eyes. It was a flicker of reassessment, a moment of calculation that Marcus knew all too well. It was the look of someone trying to reconcile what they were seeing with what they believed to be true. She hesitated for a beat too long. "Right this way," she finally said, her tone a fraction cooler than it had been for the white businessman who had boarded just ahead of them. They moved past her into the cabin. The first-class section was a sanctuary of soft lighting and hushed tones. They found their seats, spacious, private pods upholstered in dark navy leather that promised a comfortable journey across the Atlantic. As Marcus lifted his carry-on into the overhead bin, he felt a prickle on the back of his neck. He turned slightly and saw Sarah watching them from the galley. It wasn't the attentive look of good service, it felt like surveillance. Her eyes narrowed slightly as she watched Evelyn place her handbag on the seat. "Everything okay?" Evelyn asked, noticing the tension in Marcus's jaw. "Fine," Marcus lied, settling into his seat and forcing a smile for his wife. "Just eager to get in the air." He tried to brush it off. He told himself not to let a strange vibe from a single crew member spoil the anniversary. He knew from his work that flight attendants dealt with immense stress during boarding. Catering issues, slot times, difficult passengers. It was probably nothing. A few minutes later, Sarah arrived at their pod holding a silver tray with 2 glasses of champagne. Her smile was back, but it seemed painted on, a brittle facade that didn't reach her eyes. "Pre-departure champagne?" she asked, her voice high and a little too loud, projecting into the quiet cabin. "Thank you. That would be lovely," Evelyn said warmly, accepting the glass. As Sarah handed Marcus his glass, her eyes roamed over him again, taking in the cut of his suit, the watch on his wrist, and Evelyn's elegant dress. She seemed to be searching for a flaw, a loose thread, a clue that would confirm the picture she had built in her mind. She didn't walk away immediately. She stood there, tray in hand, blocking the aisle slightly. "Are you too familiar with the Polaris cabin features?" she asked. "We are," Marcus replied politely. "Thank you." She lingered. "It's just, we sometimes have passengers who are upgraded at the very last minute. Staff travel or lucky glitches, and they aren't sure how everything works. We want to make sure everyone is comfortable." The implication hung in the air like stale perfume. "You look like you were upgraded. You don't look like you paid for this." Marcus felt a familiar, weary tightening in his chest. He had felt this specific frequency of disrespect in boardrooms, at inspections, and in restaurants for 30 years. It was the soft bigotry of low expectations, the quiet questioning of his presence in spaces where some people didn't expect to see a black man. He looked at Evelyn. She had caught it too. Her smile had tightened, but she gave him a small shake of her head. "Don't engage." "We appreciate that," Marcus said, keeping his voice even and calm. "We're all set." Sarah finally retreated, but she didn't go back to work. As she walked toward the front galley, Marcus watched her reflection in the darkened window. She stopped and spoke in a low voice to the purser, a tall man with silver hair named Paul Sterling. Sarah leaned in close to Paul, whispering urgently and gesturing discreetly over her shoulder toward seats 1A and 1B. Paul stopped organizing the manifest and looked up. He adjusted his tie, his expression hardening as he stared down the aisle at Marcus and Evelyn. The quiet anticipation Marcus had felt at the gate began to curdle into a cold dread. He knew the signs. He knew the body language of a crew that had identified a problem. This wasn't just a flight attendant having a bad day. This was the beginning of something ugly. The cabin door sealed with a heavy, mechanical thud, locking the outside world away. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, a smooth, confident baritone announcing a flight time of 9 hours and 40 minutes to Paris. To the uninitiated, it was the sound of safety and routine. But to Marcus Thorne, the subtle shift in the cabin's atmosphere was screaming a warning. He tried to settle in, to recapture the celebratory mood that had been so fragile to begin with. He took a sip of his champagne, the bubbles sharp on his tongue, and looked at Evelyn. She was attempting to focus on the in-flight entertainment menu, scrolling through movies with a deliberate slowness, though Marcus could see the tension held in the set of her jaw. They didn't speak of Sarah Jenkins' lingering stare. They didn't have to. From the front galley, the purser, Paul Sterling, began his welcome tour of the Polaris cabin. Paul was a man in his late 50s with a meticulously maintained coif of silver hair and an air of profound self-importance. He moved through the aisle like a feudal lord surveying his estate. He stopped at the seat of a businessman across the aisle, a man Marcus recognized vaguely from aviation trade journals, and shared a brief, hearty laugh, shaking his hand with practiced familiarity. He spent several minutes chatting with an older white couple in the row behind them, asking about their grandchildren. When he arrived at row 1, however, the bonhomie vanished instantly. His smile didn't just fade, it was surgically removed. His posture stiffened, his shoulders squaring as if preparing for a physical confrontation. "Mr. and Mrs. Thorne, is it?" Paul began. His tone was dripping with a false civility that was somehow more insulting than a shout. He didn't wait for a reply. "I'm Paul Sterling, the purser for this flight. I just need to verify your seat assignments one more time." Marcus cleared his throat gently, keeping his hands visible and relaxed, a habit learned from decades of navigating spaces where his size could be weaponized against him. "We are in 1A and 1B, he said, lifting his phone to show the digital boarding pass again. "We showed them at the gate and to the flight attendant." Paul barely glanced at the screen. He looked over the top of his reading glasses, his eyes cold and flat. "Yes, I see that. It's just that there appears to be a discrepancy in our system." "A discrepancy?" Evelyn asked, her voice light but sharp. "We have these seats flagged for other passengers who may have been rerouted from a connection," Paul lied smoothly. "It's a common computer glitch. Sometimes the system doesn't update fast enough when upgrades are processed manually." Marcus knew airline reservation systems inside and out. He knew the Sabre system, the Amadeus system, and Vista Airways' proprietary overlay. While glitches happened, they were mathematical anomalies, rarely of this specific nature, and they were always sorted out by the gate agents before the jet bridge door was closed. Once the manifest was finalized and the door was shut, the passengers in the seats were the passengers on the flight. This was a fabrication, and a clumsy one. "I can assure you our tickets are confirmed," Marcus said, his voice dropping an octave, resonating with a professional firmness. "We booked these seats 2 months ago. Full fare. There was no manual upgrade." "Be that as it may," Paul continued, his voice hardening as he realized his first lie hadn't worked. "I need to see your ticket receipts. The actual purchase confirmation with the transaction ID." This was a highly unusual request. A boarding pass was the final authority on an aircraft. Asking for a receipt after boarding was like a police officer asking for the receipt for your car during a traffic stop. Evelyn looked up from her screen, her expression one of polite but firm disbelief. "Is there a problem, Mr. Sterling?" "Dr. Thorne," Evelyn corrected him gently. Paul's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly, a micro-expression of annoyance. The title was a complication he hadn't accounted for in the narrative he was building in his head. "Ma'am, I am simply trying to ensure everyone is in their correctly assigned seat. It is airline policy regarding cabin integrity." Sarah Jenkins reappeared at his elbow, a silent, smirking reinforcement. They stood there blocking the aisle, looming over the seated couple, creating a scene that was impossible to ignore. The businessman across the way lowered his newspaper, watching with unconcealed curiosity. The cabin, once a space of quiet luxury, was now charged with a tense, accusatory energy. "My husband has already shown you our boarding passes," Evelyn said, her voice still soft, but now edged with steel. "If there is a system glitch, perhaps it is something to take up with the ground crew when we land in Paris." "I'm afraid I can't wait until we land," Paul snapped, his patience fraying. He was dropping the pretense of customer service now. "There is a possibility that you are in possession of fraudulent boarding passes." The words hung in the air, ugly and venomous. Fraudulent. Marcus felt a surge of cold fury, a physical heat rising up his neck. But years of training in high-stakes environments took over. In the FAA, emotion was a liability. Facts were the weapon. "Mr. Sterling," Marcus said, his voice low and deliberate, "I suggest you choose your next words very carefully. You are making a serious accusation without a shred of evidence." A young woman in seat 3G, who had been watching the exchange with growing horror, leaned forward. "For goodness sake, leave them alone. They haven't done anything." Paul shot her a withering glare. "Ma'am, please remain out of official crew business." He turned back to Marcus and Evelyn. "Your receipts. Now, or I will have to involve the captain." This was the final escalation before the point of no return. Marcus knew it. They were being challenged, tested, and deliberately humiliated. The accusation wasn't about a computer glitch. It was about the fact that he and Evelyn, in the minds of Paul and Sarah, could not possibly have afforded or deserved to be in first class. They had to be fakes, frauds, or beneficiaries of some mistake that needed correcting. Evelyn didn't flush or stammer. She was methodical. She pulled out her phone, her fingers moving swiftly. She opened her email and found the booking confirmation from Vista Airways, complete with the transaction ID and the last 4 digits of the American Express card used for the purchase. She held the phone out to Paul, the screen brightness turned up to maximum. "Here is the confirmation email from your airline, sent the day we purchased these tickets," she said clearly. "As you can see, the transaction is verified. Now, are we finished with this interrogation?" Paul glanced at the phone, his face flushing a mottled red. The clear digital proof momentarily thwarted him. He had expected them to have no answer, to become flustered and angry, to give him the excuse he needed. But their calm, factual response only seemed to infuriate him more. He couldn't accept that he was wrong. He leaned in closer, invading Marcus's personal space, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial hiss so the other passengers wouldn't hear the absurdity of his next claim. "I don't know what game you're playing. Maybe you used a stolen credit card. Maybe your employee is trying to pull a fast 1-inch. "Excuse me," Marcus said, incredulous. "But this flight doesn't move until I get to the bottom of this," Paul said. Sarah Jenkins chimed in, her voice saccharine with malice. "We have to protect the integrity of the cabin, Paul. We can't have, well, gate lice." The slur hit Marcus like a physical blow. Gate lice. A derogatory industry term for people who crowd the boarding area hoping for an upgrade they don't deserve, now weaponized as a racial insult. It was a direct, undisguised attack. Marcus slowly placed his champagne flute on the tray table. The condensation left a wet ring on the linen. The time for de-escalation was over. They had crossed the line from rude to actionable. "Mr. Sterling," Marcus said, his voice now devoid of any warmth. It was the voice he used when grounding an aircraft for a cracked spar. "You have 2 options." Paul blinked, surprised by the sudden shift in authority. "You can return to your duties, and we will discuss your conduct with your superiors when we land in Paris," Marcus continued, locking eyes with the purser. "Or, you can call the captain as you threatened. But understand this. If you choose the second option, you will be initiating a sequence of events that you will not be able to control." It was not a threat. It was a statement of fact, a professional assessment of the regulatory landscape. But Paul Sterling, blinded by his own arrogance, heard it only as a challenge to his domain. His face twisted into a mask of righteous indignation. "Oh, I'll call the captain," Paul sneered. "We'll see who's in control here." He turned on his heel and strode purposefully toward the cockpit, Sarah trailing him like a loyal shadow. Marcus and Evelyn sat in a pocket of stunned silence, the eyes of the entire first-class cabin fixed upon them. The anniversary trip to Paris was over before the plane had even pushed back from the gate. Marcus looked at his wife. He saw the hurt in her eyes, but beneath it, the steel. She reached out and took his hand again. "They have no idea," she whispered. "No," Marcus replied, watching the cockpit door. "They don't." The cockpit door opened, and Paul Sterling emerged, his face flushed with vindication. Behind him was Captain Robert Evans. The captain was the picture of authority, tall, silver-haired, with 4 gold stripes on his epaulets. But as he approached their seats, his expression was not one of impartial investigation. It was the look of a man whose routine had been inconveniently interrupted. He wasn't there to listen. He was there to solve a problem created by his crew, and the easiest solution was to remove the source of the friction. "Folks," Captain Evans began, his voice carrying an easy, dismissive authority. He didn't make eye contact with Marcus or Evelyn, addressing the space between them instead. "My purser tells me there's some confusion about your seating." "Captain, there is no confusion," Marcus stated clearly, sitting up straighter. "There is, however, an accusation of fraud being leveled against my wife and me by your crew. We have shown our boarding passes and our purchase confirmation. We are in our assigned, paid-for seats." The captain finally looked at him, but his eyes were cold. He had already made his decision, siding with his crew before hearing a single word. In his mind, the hierarchy was clear, his trusted purser of 15 years versus 2 unknown passengers. "Look, I don't have time to sort out ticketing disputes on the tarmac," Captain Evans said dismissively. "My purser is responsible for the integrity of the cabin manifest. If he says there's a problem, there's a problem. We have a schedule to keep." Evelyn leaned forward, her voice sharp and precise, the voice of a doctor delivering a difficult diagnosis. "Captain, are you saying you are refusing to look at our legal documentation?" that you are taking the unsubstantiated word of your crew over documented proof. What I'm saying, ma'am, the captain retorted, his tone becoming patronizing, is that this discussion is over. The safety and security of this flight are my paramount concern. A disruptive situation in the cabin before we even take off is a security concern. We are not being disruptive, Marcus said, his voice dangerously quiet. We are sitting in our seats being harassed. That's a matter of perspective, Captain Evans said, crossing his arms. My crew feels threatened. You've become belligerent. It was a masterful, insidious trap. By calmly defending themselves against baseless accusations, they were now being labeled as aggressors. Their refusal to be silently humiliated was being reframed as belligerence. So, here's what's going to happen, the captain continued. I'm going to have to ask you to deplane. You can sort this out with the gate agents. They'll get you on the next available flight once your ticketing is verified. A collective, quiet gasp went through the cabin. The woman in 3G shook her head in disgust. The businessman across the aisle looked down, suddenly intensely interested in his shoes. No one spoke up. The humiliation was absolute. They were being declared guilty and sentenced to removal by the ultimate authority on the aircraft. Captain Evans, Marcus said. His voice resonated with a new kind of authority, deep and immovable. I want you to be very sure about this. You are invoking your captain's authority under Federal Aviation Regulation 91.3 to remove paying ticketed passengers based on the unverified claims of your crew. Is that correct? The specific citation of the regulation, FAR 91.3, gave the captain a moment's pause. It was an unusual thing for a passenger to know, but his pride and his blind trust in his crew overrode any flicker of caution. That's correct, Evans said, puffing out his chest. Now, are you going to leave peacefully, or do I need to call for airport security? Marcus looked at Evelyn. Her expression was one of deep disappointment, but also of unyielding strength. She gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. This battle was lost. The war, however, had just begun. Slowly, with a dignity that stood in stark contrast to the ugliness of the situation, Marcus and Evelyn stood up. They retrieved their bags from the overhead compartment, their movements deliberate and unhurried. Every eye in the cabin was on them. They could feel the mix of pity, discomfort, and, from some, perhaps a cruel sense of satisfaction. As they started the long walk back up the aisle, Paul Sterling and Sarah Jenkins stood near the galley, arms crossed, their expressions triumphant. Sarah had a small, vicious smirk on her face. They had won. They had identified the imposters and purged them from their silver sanctuary. The walk from seat 1B to the aircraft door was the longest walk of Marcus Thorne's life. It was a gauntlet of shame designed to break them. But as he passed row after row of silent witnesses, he wasn't broken. He was documenting. He logged every detail. The captain's exact words, the purser's smug expression, the averted eyes of the other passengers, the location of every camera in the cabin. He was no longer a husband on an anniversary trip. He was an inspector at a crash site, piecing together the chain of events that led to a catastrophic failure. As they stepped onto the jet bridge, the heavy cabin door closed behind them with a final, definitive thud. The cold air of the bridge hit them. They were alone, standing on a brightly lit bridge to nowhere. Their Parisian dream had been replaced by the harsh reality of prejudice. They had been judged, condemned, and ejected, all because the color of their skin did not match the crew's idea of a first-class passenger. Back in the terminal, the silence was heavy. The gate area, which had been bustling an hour ago, was now a ghost town of empty plastic chairs and discarded coffee cups. The flight to Paris was the last major departure of the evening, and the cleaning crews were already beginning their slow sweep of the concourse. The gate agent, a young man named Greg who had checked them in earlier, looked up from his podium. His expression was a mixture of confusion and annoyance at seeing them return. "Folks, the flight is closed." "What happened?" Greg asked. Before Marcus or Evelyn could speak, the landline on Greg's desk rang shrilly. He held up a finger, answering it. He listened for a moment, his eyes darting toward the couple standing on the other side of the counter. "Uh-huh. Okay, Captain. I understand," he mumbled. He hung up, his demeanor instantly transforming from confused to cold and official. "Captain Evans informs me you were removed for being disruptive. I need to rebook you." He typed furiously. The next flight with available first-class seats to Paris is in 2 days. I can offer you a hotel voucher and meal coupons, but that's the best I can do given the circumstances. We were not disruptive, Evelyn said calmly, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. We were targeted and harassed by the crew. Greg sighed, sliding a printed voucher across the counter. A dismissive, bureaucratic gesture meant to end the conversation. Look, ma'am, all I know is what the captain tells me. His word is final on the aircraft. Take the vouchers. This was the moment the system was designed for. This was where the airline expected them to break, to shout, to demand a supervisor, to become the angry passengers that security would then escort out. It was a script written to absorb frustration and issue token apologies. But Marcus Thorne didn't shout. He didn't even look at the vouchers. He looked at Greg, then up at the Vista Airways logo displayed on the monitor above them. He took a deep, steadying breath, the kind a sniper takes before a shot. We won't be needing those, he said quietly. He turned away from the counter and walked a few paces down the empty corridor, Evelyn standing faithfully by his side. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts, past his wife, past his brother, past his friends, and stopped on a number labeled FAA Duty Officer, SW Region. He pressed the call button. Evelyn watched him, her heart pounding. They had talked about this moment in abstract terms many times over their careers, the nuclear option. They had hoped they would never have to use it. Now, the key was turning. The phone was answered on the second ring. FAA Southwest Region Duty Office. Agent Carmichael speaking. When Marcus spoke, his voice was transformed. The weary traveler was gone. The humiliated husband was gone. In his place was Senior Inspector Marcus Thorne, badge number 772A. Agent Carmichael, this is Inspector Thorne. I need you to listen to me very carefully, Marcus said, his tone clipped and official. I am at O'Hare International, Gate K-12. Inspector Thorne, sir. Go ahead. My wife, Dr. Evelyn Thorne, and I have just been unlawfully deplaned from Vista Airways Flight 112, tail number N791VA. The flight crew, specifically Purser Paul Sterling and flight attendant Sarah Jenkins, refused to accept our valid, ticketed boarding passes. They accused us of fraud without cause. He paused, letting the facts land. We were subsequently removed from the aircraft by the pilot in command, Captain Robert Evans, under a false pretense of disruptive behavior. The captain refused to verify our documentation and cited crew safety as the reason for our removal. Understood, Carmichael said, the sound of frantic typing audible in the background. What is the nature of the violation? Agent Carmichael, I am officially declaring this a discriminatory incident in direct violation of Title 49 of the United States Code, Section 40127, prohibiting discrimination by air carriers, Marcus stated, reciting the statute from memory. Furthermore, the captain's failure to perform due diligence before removing ticketed passengers constitutes a gross neglect of duty and a potential violation of the carrier's operating certificate under 14 CFR Part 121. The silence on the other end was heavy. These weren't just complaints. These were career-ending citations. My God, sir. Understood. What are your instructions? I want you to immediately contact the Principal Operations Inspector for Vista Airways, Marcus commanded. I want a full transcript of the cockpit voice recorder, CVR, from the moment the purser entered the cockpit to the moment the cabin door was closed. I want the names and FAA certificate numbers for the entire flight crew. I want the airline to preserve all internal cabin security footage. Consider Vista Airways Chicago operations under immediate and intense scrutiny. We are initiating a full compliance investigation, effective immediately. Marcus ended the call. The anger and humiliation were still there, simmering beneath the surface, but they were now channeled into a cold, focused resolve. The power dynamic had shifted with a single phone call. They were no longer victims of the system. They were the system. Greg, the gate agent, had been watching them with growing unease. He hadn't heard the other side of the conversation, but he had heard Marcus's tone. It wasn't the tone of a passenger. It was the tone of a boss. Marcus walked back to the counter. He didn't raise his voice. He simply reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a leather wallet. He flipped it open. The gold FAA inspector's badge gleamed under the harsh terminal lighting. My name is Marcus Thorne. This is Dr. Evelyn Thorne. "We are with the Federal Aviation Administration," he said, his voice flat and hard as granite. Your flight crew, and your airline have a very serious problem." Greg stared at the badge, the color draining from his face. He looked from Marcus to Evelyn, and for the first time, he saw them not as disruptive passengers, but as what they were, two of the most powerful regulators in the aviation industry. "You will not be rebooking our flight," Marcus continued. "You will be securing our luggage, which is currently on a plane that is about to push back from the gate. You will then find your station manager and a representative from Vista Airways corporate office, because they need to be here to meet with us." Now, Greg fumbled for his phone, his hands shaking visibly. "Yes, sir. Right away, sir." The anniversary trip to Paris was officially canceled. A federal investigation had just begun. The first domino toppled at 10:47 p.m. Central Time in Vista Airways' sprawling operations center near Dallas, a high-tech nerve center known internally as the Bridge. It was a room of wall-to-wall screens, shifting weather maps, and the constant, low murmur of logistics. A senior dispatcher named Stan, a 20-year veteran who had seen everything from engine failures to mid-air berths, sat at his console. Suddenly, his screen flashed. It wasn't a mechanical alert or a weather diversion. It was a digital flag so rare and so radioactive that most controllers went their entire careers without seeing one. It was a direct line communication from the FAA's Southwest Regional Office, tagged with the highest priority code, regulatory intervention. Stan read the initial report and felt his blood run cold. It wasn't a security threat in the traditional sense. It was about Flight 112. It was about 2 passengers being removed. And those 2 passengers were FAA. "Get me Jessica Riley," Stan barked to his supervisor, his voice cracking slightly. Now, Jessica Riley, the vice president of in-flight services for Vista Airways, was currently at a black-tie charity dinner in downtown Dallas. Her phone was on silent, buried in her clutch, but she wore a smartwatch specifically for moments like this. It buzzed against her wrist, not with a text, but with a haptic pattern that meant emergency. She glanced at the face. Code read, FLT 112. FAA removal. Call immediately. Excusing herself from the table with a tight smile, Jessica stepped into a quiet marble hallway. She dialed the ops center, her heart hammering against her ribs. She listened as the frantic supervisor explained the situation, an accusation of fraud, a removal by the captain, and the names of the passengers involved. Marcus Thorne and Dr. Evelyn Thorne, the supervisor repeated. Jessica closed her eyes, leaning her forehead against the cool plaster of the wall. She didn't need to look them up. She knew exactly who they were. Marcus Thorne was a legend in the industry, a by-the-book absolutist who had personally overseen Vista Airways' last major safety audit. He was meticulous, unshakable, and had the entire code of federal regulations memorized. And Dr. Evelyn Thorne? She was even more daunting. She was a titan in the field of aeromedical science. Her research on crew fatigue and implicit bias had literally rewritten the industry's training manuals. The irony was nauseating. Her crew hadn't just mistreated 2 black passengers. They had, through sheer, catastrophic ignorance, accosted and ejected the very regulators who wrote the rules that allowed their planes to fly. "Lock it down," Jessica commanded, her voice a strained whisper. No one, and I mean no one, from that flight crew talks to the union or the media when they land. I want the Houston station manager at Marcus and Evelyn's location immediately. Treat them like royalty. No, better than royalty. Treat them like people who can shut us down with a single phone call, because they can. "I'm on my way to the airport," she added, hanging up. She stood alone in the hallway for a moment, the gravity of the situation crashing down on her. This wasn't a customer service complaint that could be smoothed over with frequent flyer miles and a form letter. This was a potential multi-million-dollar fine. It was a consent decree. It was a public relations apocalypse. And it had all happened because a flight crew couldn't fathom a black couple sitting in first class. Meanwhile, at 37,000 feet over the dark Atlantic, the crew of Flight 112 was oblivious. The cabin lights were dimmed, and most passengers were asleep. In the forward galley, Sarah Jenkins and Paul Sterling were quietly congratulating themselves, basking in the glow of what they perceived as a job well done. "You handled that perfectly, Paul," Sarah said, pouring them both a fresh cup of coffee. The arrogance of them. They were so sure of themselves. It's always the way, Paul agreed, stirring his coffee with a sense of deep satisfaction. They think they can bully their way in. But we have to maintain standards. Captain Evans saw it right away. He knew they were trouble. Disruptive and belligerent, Sarah added, savoring the buzzwords the captain had used. That's exactly what they were. We protected the cabin. We did our job. In their minds, they were heroes. They had defended the sanctity of their premium cabin from intruders. They had enforced the unspoken rules of who belongs and who doesn't. They settled in for a quiet, routine flight, chatting about their layover plans for Paris, completely unaware that on the ground below, an inferno was erupting, and they were standing at its epicenter. Their careers were already over. They just didn't know it yet. 9 hours later, Vista Airways Flight 112 descended through a blanket of low, gray stratus clouds, beginning its approach into Charles de Gaulle Airport. For the 300 passengers on board, it was the end of a long night, the anticipation of croissants and coffee replacing the fatigue of travel. For Captain Robert Evans and his crew, it was the beginning of the end. As the massive Boeing 777 taxied toward the gate, Captain Evans keyed the mic for his standard, cheerful arrival announcement. On behalf of Vista Airways and this entire flight crew, I'd like to be the first to welcome you to Paris, he said, his voice smooth and practiced. We hope you enjoyed your flight, and we look forward to seeing you on board again soon. In the forward galley, Sarah Jenkins applied a fresh coat of lipstick in the mirror. Paul Sterling straightened his tie, checking his watch. They were already mentally checking into their hotel, anticipating a pleasant 3-day layover in one of the world's most beautiful cities. They chatted idly about a bistro near the Eiffel Tower they liked to visit. The jet bridge docked with the aircraft fuselage with a soft, mechanical bump. The engines spooled down to a whine, then silence. The fasten seatbelt sign pinged off. Paul moved to the main cabin door, 1L, a routine he had performed thousands of times in his 25-year career. He disarmed the slide, rotated the heavy handle, and pushed the door open. He expected to see the usual gaggle of French ground crew in neon vests, perhaps a gate agent holding paperwork. But this time was different. Standing on the jet bridge, blocking the exit path, were two stern-faced men in dark suits wearing earpieces. And standing between them, looking like an apparition from a corporate nightmare, was Jessica Riley, the vice president of in-flight services. Jessica was a corporate legend, a name that appeared on policy memos and holiday emails, not a face you saw on a jet bridge in Paris at 7 a.m. Her expression was arctic. "Paul," she said. She didn't shout, but her voice cut through the ambient noise like a razor. "Keep the passengers on board. I want the entire flight crew, Captain Evans, the first officer, you, and Ms. Jenkins, to step off the aircraft." Now, Paul's triumphant smirk from 9 hours ago evaporated instantly. It was replaced by a wave of cold confusion. "Jessica? What is this? Is something wrong?" Paul stammered. "Everything is wrong, Paul," she replied, her eyes boring into him. "Get your crew." Minutes later, the four of them were escorted off the plane, down a service stairway, and into a windowless briefing room deep within the bowels of the airport's operations area. The room was sterile, lit by harsh fluorescent strips that hummed aggressively. The two men in suits, global security, stood by the door, arms crossed. Jessica Riley didn't sit. She stood at the head of the table, tossing a file folder onto the surface. "At approximately 9:35 p.m. Central Time last night, you removed 2 passengers from Flight 112, she began, her tone dangerously calm. "I want you to tell me exactly what happened." "Captain Evans," you begin. Captain Evans, still radiating a fading aura of command, looked annoyed rather than concerned. He leaned back in his chair, crossing his legs. "It was a minor security issue, Jessica," Evans said dismissively. 2 passengers were being disruptive, harassing the cabin crew over a ticketing issue. They were becoming belligerent. I made a command decision to deplane them to ensure the safety of the flight. It was a textbook call. Jessica stared at him, her disbelief palpable. "A textbook call, Robert? Who were these passengers?" "I don't know their names," the captain shrugged. "An African-American couple. My purser felt their credentials weren't legitimate." Jessica's gaze shifted to Paul, who stood a little straighter, still clinging to the belief that he had done the right thing. "Mr. Sterling," Jessica said, "tell me why you believe their tickets were fraudulent." "Well, Paul began, his tone self-assured. They just didn't seem to fit the profile of our typical first-class clientele. They seemed nervous, and when I questioned them, they became very defensive. It was a gut feeling, Paul continued, based on my 25 years of experience. Sarah felt it too. Sarah nodded eagerly from the corner. They had a real attitude when we asked for receipts. It was a classic intimidation tactic. Jessica Riley felt a surge of nausea. Gut feeling. Profile. Attitude. They were openly admitting to discrimination, reciting the very definitions of racial bias, but they were so blinded by their own prejudice that they were presenting it as good police work. She took a deep breath. It was time to detonate the bomb. The passengers you removed, she began, her voice dropping to an icy whisper that forced them to lean in, were Marcus Thorne and Dr. Evelyn Thorne. The names meant nothing to them. They stared back at her blankly. Jessica continued, her voice rising with each sentence. Perhaps you know them by their titles. The man you accused of fraud and labeled a threat is FAA Senior Air Carrier Safety Inspector Marcus Thorne. He led our last full operational audit. The woman you dismissed, and whose professional title you ignored, is Dr. Evelyn Thorne, the FAA's leading consultant on human factors. Her work is the foundation for half of the manuals you are supposed to have memorized. The reaction was visceral. The color drained from their faces as if a plug had been pulled. Captain Evans, who had been leaning casually, sat bolt upright. Paul Sterling swayed slightly, gripping the back of a chair. Sarah Jenkins' jaw went slack, her eyes widening with dawning, catastrophic horror. The disruptive passengers you ejected from your aircraft, Jessica said, hitting every word like a hammer blow, are, for all intents and purposes, the United States federal government. They are the people who grant us our license to operate. And you didn't just inconvenience them. You committed a series of flagrant violations of federal law, on the record, in front of a cabin full of witnesses. She opened the file and read from a preliminary report sent by the FAA. Violation 1. Unlawful discrimination based on race. A direct breach of Title 49 U.S. Code. Violation 2. Failure to follow company and federal protocols for verifying passenger documentation. Violation 3. Captain Evans, your removal of passengers under Regulation 91.3 was based on false information from your crew, which you did not verify. This constitutes a gross dereliction of your duties as pilot in command. She looked up, her face a mask of cold fury. While you were serving drinks over the Atlantic, Inspector Thorne was initiating a full-scale federal investigation into Vista Airways, starting with this flight. Starting with you. He has already requested the cockpit voice recordings and all cabin footage. Your FAA certificates have been flagged. Your careers, she said, delivering the final verdict, as of 9 hours ago, are effectively over. Silence. The hum of the room's ventilation system was deafening. The self-congratulatory narrative they had built for themselves had been utterly obliterated. They weren't heroes who protected the cabin. They were liabilities who had potentially crippled the airline. Paul Sterling was the first to break. His voice was a pathetic squeak. It was a mistake. A misunderstanding. No, Jessica cut him off, slamming her hand on the table. A misunderstanding is getting a drink order wrong. What you did was an act of profound arrogance and prejudice. You are all grounded, effective immediately. You will be flown back to the U.S. and coached tomorrow to meet with our legal team and FAA investigators. Do not talk to each other. Do not talk to anyone. Hand over your company IDs and passports to security. She turned to leave, then paused at the door, delivering one final, devastating assessment. You know, the truly pathetic thing is, she said, looking directly at Sarah and Paul, they probably would have been the most interesting people to talk to on that entire flight. But you couldn't see past your own bigotry to find out. The door clicked shut, leaving the three of them in the sterile room. Their layover in Paris had been transformed into a purgatory of their own making. The hard karma they couldn't have imagined in their wildest nightmares had just landed. The fallout was not swift. It was a slow, meticulous, and crushing avalanche of consequences, engineered by the very system the crew of Flight 112 had sworn to uphold. For Marcus and Dr. Evelyn Thorne, this was never about personal revenge. It was about rectifying a systemic failure that had allowed prejudice to masquerade as policy. To ensure the integrity of the process, they immediately recused themselves from the direct investigation, handing the case over to a special task force within the FAA's Washington headquarters. But the machine they had set in motion was relentless, thorough, and blind to excuses. Sarah Jenkins was the first to fall. During her interview with the FAA's Office of Civil Rights and Vista Airways legal team, she crumbled. Without Paul Sterling there to reinforce her narrative, her justifications about gut feelings and gate lice were exposed for what they were: textbook racial bias. Her 20-year career ended with a single, sterile email from Human Resources informing her of her immediate termination for gross misconduct. But the true blow came from the federal government. The FAA found that her actions demonstrated a profound lack of judgment incompatible with the responsibilities of a safety professional. Her FAA Airman certificate was suspended indefinitely, with a recommendation for permanent revocation. Unable to work in the industry and facing potential civil lawsuits, the uniform she had worn as a shield was stripped away, leaving her to face a future she had never imagined. Paul Sterling, the purser who had sneered at Marcus, fared no better. In the interrogation room, he attempted to shift the blame, claiming he was only following the captain's lead. But the investigation team had already interviewed the other passengers, including the young woman from seat 3G. She gave a detailed, sworn statement that painted a clear picture of Paul as the lead instigator, the man who had actively escalated a calm situation into a confrontation. He was fired on the same day as Sarah. The FAA revoked his certificate as well. His decades of perceived authority vanished overnight, leaving him with nothing but the bitter ashes of his own arrogance. Captain Robert Evans faced the most complex reckoning. As the pilot in command, his responsibility was absolute. His failure was not one of malice, but of a catastrophic lapse in judgment born of complacency and blind trust in a biased crew. The FAA did not revoke his license immediately. Instead, he was suspended for a year without pay. To ever fly again for a commercial carrier, he was ordered to undergo an exhaustive retraining program. Hundreds of hours of sensitivity training, conflict resolution simulations, and regulatory recertification. Vista Airways terminated his command. He would never again be a captain for the airline. If he managed to complete his retraining, a massive if, the best he could hope for was a first officer position on a regional jet. It was a humiliating demotion. The 4 gold stripes he wore with such pride were gone, a direct result of his failure to look past the uniforms of his crew and see the humanity of his passengers. The airline itself felt the full force of the regulatory hammer. The investigation spearheaded by Marcus's colleagues unearthed a pattern of inadequately addressed passenger complaints regarding biased treatment. Flight 112 was not an anomaly. It was the symptom of a deep-seated cultural disease. Vista Airways was fined $2.75 million by the FAA, one of the largest civil penalties ever levied for a single discriminatory incident. But the financial penalty was only the beginning. To avoid further crippling sanctions, the airline entered into a consent decree with the FAA. This legally binding agreement mandated a complete, top-to-bottom overhaul of their in-flight service training. They were forced to develop a mandatory 40-hour course for all 25,000 crew members focused on identifying implicit bias. They had to establish an independent oversight committee and implement a no-fault reporting system for crew members to report colleagues' biased behavior. And in a move of profound poetic justice, the FAA appointed an external consultant to help design and approve this new curriculum. That consultant was Dr. Evelyn Thorne. She took a leave of absence from her other duties to personally write the playbook that would ensure what happened to her and Marcus would never happen again. The very woman Paul Sterling had tried to silence was now the voice teaching his former colleagues how to be human beings. The story inevitably leaked to the press. A passenger from the flight anonymously contacted the Washington Post, and the resulting article, First Class Injustice, Black FAA Inspectors Ejected from Vista Airways, went viral. Public outcry was immense. Vista Airways stock dipped, and for months, the airline became the poster child for corporate prejudice. 6 months later, Marcus and Evelyn Thorne finally took their anniversary trip. They flew a different airline. As they settled into their first-class seats, the flight attendant, a young man with a genuine smile, greeted them warmly. "Welcome aboard, Mr. and Dr. Thorne," he said, checking his manifest. "Can I get you a glass of champagne to start?" There was no hesitation in his eyes, no flicker of suspicion, no demand for receipts. Just professional courtesy and respect. As the plane took off, soaring above the clouds and banking toward the Atlantic, Evelyn looked at Marcus. The ordeal had cost them their dream vacation that night in Chicago, but it had fueled their life's mission. It wasn't Paris, she said softly, squeezing his hand. No, Marcus replied, looking out at the horizon. It wasn't. But maybe, in the end, it was more important. Their personal pain had been forged into a powerful instrument of change, creating a ripple effect that would touch every flight, every crew member, and every passenger for years to come. The karma that had visited Sarah, Paul, and Captain Evans was not just punitive, it was productive. It was a hard, painful, but necessary course correction. The story of Marcus and Evelyn Thorne is a stark reminder that the worst prejudices often hide behind a uniform and a smile. What their tormentors on Flight 112 forgot is that true authority isn't found in a title, a badge, or a captain's stripes. It is found in integrity, truth, and the quiet dignity with which you carry yourself. They thought they were kicking off two people who didn't belong. Instead, they kicked open the door to their own destruction and forced an entire industry to look in the mirror. If this story of justice resonated with you, please let us know your thoughts in the comments below. What part of the crew's reckoning felt the most deserved? Don't forget to like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more true stories of when arrogance meets accountability.